Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Larry Kudlow, CNBC and Kudlow Radio on the Weekend joins. We are going to turn to Grubergate. We're going to talk about the Affordable Care Act and Mr. Gruber, the MIT architect of the Affordable Care Act. We must begin with the breaking news that in the United States Senate, lame duck session, Democratic majority, Harry Reid, Dick Durbin, a vote has been held on Keystone XL pipeline to complete a pipeline in Nebraska that would make it possible for not only the oil sands of Alberta to flow to the Gulf of Mexico where the refineries wait, but also the oil of the Bakken to flow to the rest of the United States. That oil is now instead being shipped by rail. Larry, a very good evening to you. The vote falls one short of 60. Joining in this vote were all Democrats. Mary Landrieu, the Democrat facing a runoff in January, was pleading with her colleagues to sustain not the filibuster. This was the bill itself, and it was defeated. How do you take this, Larry, after the midterm success? So the Democrats acting out of pique? Is this a tantrum? What is their strategy? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. There's a bunch of angles to this. One of them is the Mary Landrieu angle. Democrats probably figure she's going to lose anyway. And, by the way, Congressman Cassidy was the sponsor in the House. He's the one that's going to beat her, and he's up by 15 points. So they probably didn't care about that. Second point shows you how far left the Democratic Party has moved and how dependent they are on far-left environmental financings, like this guy Tom Steyer and so forth. This is really a Sandinista party. I mean, it's really fantastic to me. But there are other issues here worth mentioning that the Democrats don't seem to care about. You mentioned transportation. Look,
yes.
The Bakken Shale up in North Dakota has been shipping by trucks and by trains. And that's a lot more dangerous than pipeline. A lot more dangerous. Democrats don't seem to care about that. Now, in terms of pipeline capacity, Harold Hamm tells me and others, they've made deals now to ship 50% on other pipelines, but that still leaves 50%. But the safety factor is very, very important. Other thing is U.S.-Canadian relations. Let's throw in, besides that, the impact on Europe. We could be helping the Europeans. There should have been an export provision in this bill, so that all restrictions for export are lifted. We can send oil and gas to Europe, and that takes the stranglehold away from Putin, who himself has an economy that's imploding. My final point, John, is this. In some ways, it's a gift, I suppose, because it's going to pass the next Congress.
Right.
It's going to pass the new Congress. They will have more than enough votes, not only to stop a filibuster, but to defeat a presidential veto. And if Mr. Obama does veto the bill, his veto will not only be overridden, but will indicate how much less power and influence he really has.
We're joined by Avik Roy. We raced immediately to the Affordable Care Act because Larry introduces the fact that the president is facing a Republican majority come the 114th Congress, and that it applies no more to anything else than it does to the Affordable Care Act. Avik, Professor Gruber of MIT, we've heard much about his name these last days. The White House, and in fact the President of the United States, have been pushing away the significance of Mr. Gruber and his remarks. Clarify for the audience, Avik. You keep the apothecary at Forbes.com. You're at the Manhattan Institute. You write passionately about the Affordable Care Act these last years. Is Mr. Gruber an architect of the Affordable Care Act? Is he a man who went inside the infrastructure and described it exactly during the passing of the bill? Good evening, Avik.
Good evening to you. Well, there is absolutely no doubt that Jonathan Gruber was the architect of Obamacare. And we don't merely have to assert it. There's an incredible amount of documentary evidence that Gruber was the architect. Now, that doesn't mean he wrote the actual legislation. That was done by the Senate Finance Committee. But the architecture, the design, the idea that you have to have an individual mandate forcing everyone to buy coverage, that you have to regulate the insurance products to protect people from pre-existing conditions, and then you have to subsidize the people who can't afford to be forced to buy insurance. That is the Gruberian concept that Obamacare would not exist without.
Well, okay. Look at two quick points here. One, I'm going to argue that the American public hated Obamacare even before this arrogant academic from MIT said what he said, calling voters stupid. Voters weren't so stupid. They elected a Republican House in 2010 in response to Obamacare. Unfortunately, it didn't affect the presidential election because of Romneycare, which, by the way, Gruber helped write Romneycare. But in 2014, this most recent election, Obamacare was a huge issue, a revolt against Obamacare. So I'm just saying that, you know, Gruber or not, I mean, stupid remarks, yes, okay, arrogant remarks, yes. But I want to ask you about another thing. Gruber has said publicly that the insurance subsidies are tied to state-based exchanges,
right.
Okay? And you've got a bunch of court decisions pending. Now, if they ask him to testify, you know, get him on the witness stand or whatever you do, all they have to do is play a January 10th, 2012 speech at the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco. This factoid courtesy of a gentleman who emailed it to me today. In other words, the whole thing may hinge on Gruber's statement of intentions that the federal government couldn't give subsidies outside the state-run exchanges, and that would destroy Obamacare.
Well, it's that last sentence where I'm not with you, Larry. I don't think it would destroy Obamacare, and here's why. So let's say you don't have subsidies flowing through a federal exchange. Let's say the Supreme Court does side with the challengers, the anti-Obamacare challengers in this case. What's going to happen? All of a sudden you're going to have a bunch of states that are going to have a choice between, oh, do I set up an exchange and thereby have a gusher of hundreds of millions of federal dollars flow to my state at no other cost to me? Or do I just say, no, I'm not going to set up an exchange? The vast majority of states, even Republican states, will take the money. We've seen that with the Medicaid expansion. A lot of Republican states, though not all, have expanded Medicaid. With the exchanges, it's going to be a much, much bigger conversion because, unlike Medicaid, the states have to pay a big chunk of that Medicaid expansion. They have to fund that themselves, which is a big problem for those states. The exchanges, on the other hand, that's 100% federal dollars. They will take the money.
Okay, Avik, but you know what? The bill will have to be rewritten. Right. In accordance with
with a Republican majority. In other words, the ground doesn't stay the same, Larry. I take your point. Right. The Republicans will react to the Supreme Court decision.
Right. Avik, many states may do what you want or what you're forecasting. Many states will not, Avik. You know that. Just because, let's take a look at the Medicaid argument. Some Republican states did. Most of them did not. Those Republican states that don't like Obamacare, they're not going to convert. Now, I'm just saying, this opens the legislative door in Congress. And once that door is open, I don't care what Obama says, this whole thing is going to be rewritten.
I want to press that point, Avik, I want to press that point because you've made this very cogent argument before. You have to allow for the fact that the Republicans will respond. Mr. Ryan will have a plan to offset the state's anxieties, and it will very much look like reform.
So here's the thing I think you're not taking into account, both of you, with all due respect, is that you're thinking politically about this. You're thinking, well, the Republican base in these Republican states won't stand for an expansion of these exchanges. And what you're not taking into account, because I know this because I've traveled to these states. I've fought the Medicaid expansion because I've been so convinced of how problematic it is. And you know if I lose the battle, who I lose it to? It's not to the voters. It's to the lobbyists. The healthcare industry, particularly hospitals, but also insurance companies, lobby heavily in favor of expanding Obamacare. And they have enormous money. They have enormous resources. They're often the #1 employers in their states, and they push hard to expand Obamacare, particularly when it comes to Medicaid exchanges. And it's just my sober assessment, not based on my rooting interest. It's my sober assessment that the lobbyists will have a lot more sway than a lot of people are anticipating.
Gentlemen, we need to turn to the Cadillac tax because that is also an aspect of Mr. Gruber's revelations. And Avik has a piece up at the Forbes.com that quotes the president speaking against John McCain having to do with overtaxing health care benefits. What the president said in 2008, what Jonathan Gruber says about the Cadillac tax, and what the American people will do once it is explained to them that this was meant to take over everything. Larry Kudlow of CNBC and Kudlow Radio on the Weekend, Avik Roy of Forbes.com, he's at the Manhattan Institute. Mr. Gruber's revelations and what is to be done in the new Congress. I'm John Batchelor.